Thank you. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Dan Engebretson. Dan joined USD in 2005 to lead the newly established Center for the Research and Development of Light-Activated Materials, one of the original governor's research centers. Under his leadership, the center focused on commercializing university technologies with bioadhesives as a key target area. Recognizing the need for advanced biomedical engineering education in South Dakota, Dan partnered with faculty at South Dakota Mines to launch a PhD program in biomedical engineering. To house the program, he worked with USD President Jim Abbott and economic developers in Sioux Falls to secure funding for USD's Graduate Education and Applied Research Gear Center, now part of USD Sioux Falls. The Gear Center is home to USD's Biomedical Engineering Department, which has expanded from a graduate-only program to include bachelor's degrees, and I'll break from my little script here to say I have a number of students in that program, and it is fantastic. It also serves as the biotech and medtech business incubator for USD's Discovery District. About 5 years ago, Dan became Vice President for Research at USD, where he continues to focus on technology-based economic development, driving innovation and growth for the university and for the region. So welcome, Dan.
All right, well, thank you, Melissa. And just to kind of stay in the colon cancer space, to keep lifting up good things, what my wife did was she scheduled us on back-to-back days so that I could drive her one day and then she could drive me the next day. That's a very good way to do it and make it very much a bonding experience. And I do encourage folks, Dave Barry, who's a wonderful writer, wrote a story, I don't know how many years ago it was, but just describing the prep experience, at least what he thought the prep experience was before he actually underwent the prep experience. His belief of the prep experience involved you should install seat belts on your toilet, was kind of one of the highlights of it. But that really isn't what the prep experience is all about. But that's a wonderful story to read. And then to kind of do one last connection into it, and this isn't promoting, hopefully, but my son works for Exact Sciences, which is the company that makes the Cologuard test. So just kind of the way weird things end up tying together, and we like to think this is a very large world, but it really is not. We know lots of different things there. And so, as Melissa said, I'm the Vice President for Research here at USD. I recognize quite a few of the faces here. This is actually, I think, as I was thinking about this, is my third time I've presented here. One time when I just started at USD and talked about the CRDLM, and good job getting that mouthful out. I wasn't responsible for naming that center. I came into it after it was named. And then also when we got another governor's research center to establish the BioCenter. Kind of talked about that here as well. But today I'm going to be talking about some recent happenings in research at USD. I'm flying without a slides or anything because I didn't want it to become a lecture, so I'll look to Kevin and John, maybe if I'm getting too long-winded to grab me off the stage because I can get going and talk for a long time here. But tell you about some of the things that are happening at USD and then kind of the federal environment that we're in right now and that's impacts on research here at USD. So one thing that I want to make sure that I really lift up is a great accomplishment that USD has had in our chemistry department. Dr. Haran Sun earlier this year was part of a team that received a National Science Foundation Engineering Research Center. These are unheard of awards for universities like the University of South Dakota. These are, Stanford has them, MIT has them, those sorts of things. But Dr. Sun partnered with researchers at, I want to make sure I've got the list here, University of Kansas, Notre Dame, University of Maryland, Lehigh University, and University of Hawaii to establish the Environmental Applied Refrigerant Technology Hub. The acronym for that is EARTH. And basically they're looking at kind of this, you'd be amazed when you learn how much of our economy is spent on keeping things cold and cool, from giant refrigerators to keeping our data centers cool and tremendous amounts of refrigerants are used in there. They have huge impacts on the environment. Getting rid of old refrigerants is almost impossible, and so the Earth Center is really looking at these circular uses. How do we better use refrigerants? How do we get new refrigerants that are more efficient? And it really is going to be, I think, a breakthrough through the state of South Dakota, because when you look at, if you go up to Sioux Falls and you look on the north edge of town, north of the USD Sioux Falls campus, you'll see just giant refrigerators up there, the wind chill plant, where they're trucking stuff in and keeping it cold there and trucking it out. We spend a lot of money on refrigerants in the state of South Dakota. So that's going to be a great thing, and is going to help me, hopefully, achieve some of my goals in terms of tech-based economic development, because I see that is one of the key roles that universities have in our society, is to prepare both the workforce and the ideas to keep us on the cutting edge, at the leading forefront of things. And so I wanted to make sure that I got that lifted up before I kind of start to shift into some of the darker news and I'll try to end on a positive note, because I actually am very bullish about the prospects for continued federal funding for research, and hopefully I'll get you onto that same page with me by the end of this conversation. And as I'm going, I invite people to ask questions as I go. I would like to see this more of a conversation than a lecture. That's why I intentionally didn't go with any slides up here today. And so kind of where we're at federally from a budget perspective, a handful of weeks ago, a 6-month continuing resolution was passed to fund the government through September. So there's going to be no more government shutdowns or anything that occurred during this current fiscal year. That particular continuing resolution locked in about a 3.5% cut to federal R&D funding, a couple $100 billion when you look at the scale of the total federal budget. But that loss was actually less of a loss than had happened the year before, because we'd basically for many years with the ARPA funding and stuff that was going, we were dumping lots and lots of dollars in, so these cuts really weren't cuts that were happening. And so the continuing resolution didn't hurt us particularly bad there. And also important to keep in mind in terms of federal funding for particularly University of South Dakota and other what we call EPSCoR states. Are people, when I say the term EPSCoR, does anybody know what I'm talking about? So I see a few hands coming up. But the EPSCoR program was started back in the 1980s by the National Science Foundation. And at the time in the 1980s, the acronym was for the Experimental Program Experimental Program for Competitive Research. Experimental EPSCoR, whatever, something like that. I used to roll off my tongue like a lick, and they recently changed it from the experimental program after about 40-some years to the established program. So they kept the exact same acronym, they just changed the first words for that. And basically, EPSCoR makes funding available to states that don't receive much federal funding. And there's currently 25 states, and then Guam, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, so 28 jurisdictions that are eligible to receive EPSCoR funding. And when you look at the CHIPS and Science Act that was passed back in 2022, so again, this is legislatively locking things in. Those are things that only Congress can really make changes to. That CHIPS and Science Act required that 20% of the National Science Foundation's budget gets put into EPSCoR states. And at that time when that law was passed, only about 13.5% of their budget, of NSF's budget, went into EPSCoR states. And so they're still short of that mark. And so right now the National Science Foundation is trying to get as much money as it can into EPSCoR states. And so at least for the short-term period, at least and from an NSF funding perspective, which is one of the big funding sources that we have here at USD, we're in good shape. It's kind of great to be in that less well-funded state right now. And so that's, I think, important to keep in mind. But one of the most, in my opinion, one of the biggest disappointments that I've seen in this current administration, in this current budget scenario, is the National Science Foundation recently announced their Graduate Research Fellowship Award winners. Most years they give out 2,300 of those awards, which are a 5-year award, but the students can use 3 years. They get 3 years of funding for a very competitive stipend to go to whichever graduate program they want to. It's about $37,000 a year, and they don't have to pay tuition. So it's a really great program to develop our scientific workforce here in the nation. And this year they only announced 1,000 winners. Now they're not saying that they're necessarily done, but that was kind of a big disappointment for me. And then also some short-term impacts that we're seeing with all of the reduction in force that has occurred. There's a lot fewer federal employees at the various agencies, and I would imagine their morale on a good day is low. When one day you're fired and the next day you're hired and then you're fired again and hired again, they have no idea what's going on. And so we're seeing that the award process, from how are proposals getting reviewed and how are the awards finally getting made, that's kind of slowing down and bogged down a little bit here. And so those are some kind of real world things that we're seeing that are happening here. But that's kind of the current budget situation that we're in. You probably heard probably about a week or so ago, week and a half or so ago now, that the Senate and House agreed on a budget resolution. And that sets them up for their budget reconciliation process. And kind of do a little bit of a civics lesson. Reconciliation is things that you can do to the budget without needing a filler budget. You only need a simple majority. So you just need 51 votes to do that in the Senate and 218 in the House, if I did my math right. So simple majorities get the reconciliation process going. And the heart of that resolution is going to be $1.5 trillion in net spending cuts. And that sounds terrifying for lots of folks. You know, what are we going to be cutting? And it should sound terrifying for lots of folks. But from a federal funding for research perspective, I'm not worried at all. Because in the reconciliation process, because it only requires a simple majority, they can't undo appropriated money. And they also can't touch Social Security. Now, that's a mandatory spending, but they can't touch that. That's part of the rules of reconciliation. And the vast majority of federal R&D funding comes through the appropriations process. And so, again, that's hands-off from that reconciliation process. And so I think from a R&D perspective, reconciliation isn't going to hurt us in any significant way. Now we'll start to get to the FY26 budget. This was the process that's just starting to get going. I'm going to start with the bad news. If you pay attention to some of the groups that I listen to, the White House, through a process that they call passback. So they basically reach out to the agencies as the White House is starting to build the president's budget for FY26, saying, this is what we want you to do, what's it going to cost, and those sorts of things. That's called the passback process. And NASA has leaked some information that they were told to basically cut their budget in half. You know, what's it going to look like if we cut the budget in half at NASA? And then NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they were told to basically zero out their budget for some weather, climate, and some institutes that they funded at universities. Again, that's some of the information that's been leaked out on those sources. So obviously the White House is looking at doing some cuts that would have impacts on research and development. But remember, and this is where I think people need to, we see a lot of people that are panicking, running around. They don't take time to sit and think and remember that the White House doesn't have the purse strings, Congress does. And so when you look over at the Senate, so Joni Ernst in the Small Business Committee, Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee in the Senate, they just came out with the Innovate Act back in early March. And this is part of the legislation that's going to be part of the appropriation package in FY26. And I love bills called Innovate. Those are the sorts of things that we like to do and want to do. It's coming out of the small business and entrepreneurship, again, things that I really like. So I watch these things quite a bit. She's not planning on any budget cuts. And so I don't think that what the White House is talking about is necessarily aligned with what Congress has intended to do. And even among the more wackadoodle folks in Congress, I haven't heard them talking about, oh, gee, we really need to stop funding R&D so that we can get lapped by China. And so I think as the budget process develops, my hope is that cooler heads prevail. There will probably be some cuts because I think we have gotten a little the past several years we were doing some gross deficit spending, but I don't think R&D will be necessarily targeted for any greater cuts than anything else. So again, I suspect there will be cuts, but there won't be necessarily any cuts focused on, oh, let's get rid of the R&D enterprise in the U.S. And so I'm generally pretty excited and truly believe that we're going to see a strong federal funding environment for research and development. I think the priority areas are going to shift. a little bit. I think there's going to be a lot that goes into AI. Trump's already been talking about the moonshot that they want to do in terms of AI. I think fusion energy is a very important thing that they want to look at. And origins of disease are things that they're going to be looking at. Probably less focus on treatment of the disease and more why are we seeing this huge growth in chronic disease, and less focus on treating it, how do we prevent the chronic diseases from occurring in the first place. So we'll see some shifting in priorities, but not necessarily any overall shifting in funds. And those sorts of shifting in priorities are common with every administrative change that we have. Now, most administrative changes that we have, they do it in rational, thoughtful ways and let things die off, and they don't just go out and pull the trigger. I'm knocking this thing. Sorry about that. We're taking very much a fire-ready aim approach right now, and you can't get that bullet back once the trigger has been pulled. And so I think the approach that they're taking is bombastic, but I don't think it's frankly much different than any other agency has done with it, or any other administration has done when they've focused research on their particular interests. So that's kind of where I'm looking at from a budget perspective. I'm going to transition here a little bit to some cuts that really weren't cuts, but they made the news as being cuts. Because it literally was the headline news of, they're cutting $4 billion from medical research. This was happening back in early February that this was popping up. Got again, looking to the crowd here. Who knows what direct and indirect costs are? Because that's been we see a little bit of it there. I'll give just kind of a tutorial on that before and if I start going too long, pull me off, getting into the weeds. But when you look at a budget for a research proposal, there's two categories of costs. You have direct costs. Those are defined in the Code of Federal Regulations of things that can be easily identified with the objective that you're trying to accomplish. So if you've got a research project, this is going to be the salaries of the people that are specifically working on that, the materials and supplies that you use to do that, the tuition for the graduate student that's part of their dissertation. Those are the things that fall into that direct cost category. And so if you think of this kind of as a parallel to an oil change, if you go to a gas station or a service station to get your oil changed, that's going to be the oil, that the technician that's doing the work on it. Those are the direct costs associated with that. On the indirect cost side, you have those things that aren't so easily identified with stuff. So from an administration perspective, because we often call these indirect costs F&A, facilities and administrative costs. And so the administrative side is, well, HR. We have lots of people at the University of South Dakota, many of whom aren't doing anything that's even remotely related to research. Some that do a little bit that's related to research, but we still have to have HR people that are helping do payroll and all those things. So HR is an administrative cost. Purchasing. Again, we purchase lots of stuff. Not all of it is research related. And so those are the kind of the administrative costs. And then facilities things. The researchers, we pay their salaries, we pay for their materials and supplies as direct costs, but we don't pay for the space they work in. And we've got lots of really expensive, important, unique spaces at the university to support these research. And so those are the sorts of things that are facilities costs. And what was established again by statute, and this is important to remember as this conversation, as my discussion evolves, that it was established by statute, again, legislatively back in 1962, that universities, rather than trying to itemize those indirect costs, they can just charge them as a rate, an F&A rate of your direct costs. So as an example, most universities are probably sitting somewhere around an F&A rate of 50%. And so what you do with a budget is you add up all of your direct costs. So let's say we count about $100,000 in direct costs. Then we multiply that by 50%. To get us $50,000 in indirect costs. The way we got to that 50% is we negotiated with the Department of Health and Human Services. We gave them literally about 1,200 pages of spreadsheet files where they look through all these different cost categories, and we have our accountants look at it, and they have their accountants look at it, and a little bit of arm wrestling, and they win all the time. And that's how we got to 50%, or actually 49.5% being our rate, but I'm going to use 50% because it's easy. And so when you get an award then, if you get a $150,000 total award, $100,000 of that is direct costs, $50,000 of that is indirects. So basically 33%, a third of our budget would be for indirects. The reality is it's actually a little bit less than that because there's some things that we can't charge indirects on. So if you build a building, you don't get to charge indirects on that. Or if you buy a really expensive piece of equipment, you don't get to charge indirects on that because it's only one purchase. So what if it was $1 million? It still only took the purchasing department one thing to do. So the actual rate, when you look at most universities, somewhere 27-28% of your total costs are those indirect costs. And that's what when it started to make headlines, first back in February, NIH said that they're going to cap F&A at 15%. So basically about half of what we were actually bringing in. And that would be devastating to USD. In 2024, we brought in about $5 million of indirects that are important for how do we operate this institution. That would have dropped down to about $1.5 million. So we would have lost about $3.5 million in funding. But thankfully, again, I have a lot of trust in our system, a lot of faith in our system. Cooler heads prevailed. A lawsuit was filed. Temporary restraining order issued. All my staff is learning these things like temporary restraining orders and temporary injunctions and permanent injunctions and all those great pieces of language that we never thought we would have that stopped that rate cut. But again, the administration was talking about this. This is going to be savings to the government, money we're not going to spend. The administration doesn't necessarily understand the separation of powers. Congress had appropriated those funds, so they don't get to not spend them. That's the whole impoundment rescission sort of discussion that's going on that hasn't been dealt with. But those dollars have to get spent, so they really can't cut them. And it turns out when you look at the history of F&A rates, pretty much every president has tried to cap them. In Trump 1.0 in 2017, in his budget, he had proposed a 10% F&A cap on NIH. Congress went over that. I'll talk about that more later. That's why I don't worry too much when the White House right now is telling agencies to plan on cutting your budget in half, because the White House doesn't have those keys. Congress does. And before Trump, the Obama administration had tried to cap F&A rates without success. Trump 1.0 didn't have success. The Obama administration tried twice to cap F&A rates. They didn't have success. Bush never tried. Clinton did try and did succeed a little bit. He got a cap put on the administrative portion of F&A rates. So most universities, and USD is one of them, our actual administrative costs are about 32%, but we're only allowed to take 26%. So the university is already financially participating in research. And it turns out we're actually even more than that. But a lot of people have taken swings at this. But back to that 2017 that Trump had tried to do, Congress took it upon itself in its budget for 2018. So again, this had been happening in 2017. They're working on their budget. Congress said for NIH specifically that we recognize there are direct and indirect costs of research. Those indirect costs are calculated as an F&A rate, and that is how we are appropriating these funds. And so basically, what the Trump administration tried to do with NIH funding was illegal. And that's what the judge found. That's why there's a permanent injunction. The Trump administration is appealing it, but they're almost certainly going to lose at that end. Because again, that is locked into appropriation. That was called the 224 rider. Again, another phrase that I thought that I wouldn't carry around with me. And that 224 rider was in the 2018 Appropriations Act, the 2019 Appropriations Act, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, which were on continuing resolution. And so you certainly can't argue that that wasn't the will of the Congress to have those dollars appropriated that way. And so those cuts, I am quite confident aren't happening. There's still a lot of people running around sure that they're going to happen. They're not. There's a lot of that panic that goes on out there. And then most recently, there was the Trump administration tried this with the Department of Energy. That was last Friday at 4:26. I forget which time it was that I got the email that they're going to start impose a 15% cap. They tried an interesting curveball with this one, because then they decided on Monday at either 4:11 or 4:26, I forget the exact which one was which time in the afternoon, that we got a notice terminating all of our awards. So our Department of Energy awards have been terminated at this juncture. They'll give me an opportunity to reinstate them if I agree to a 15% indirect rate. Haven't done that at this point, because again, those lawsuits are in process. If we choose to accept that right now, I can't hop in on the lawsuit, which I think is also going to win. The DOE isn't as protected in the appropriations clause as NIH was, but there's still, again, 1962 was when it was codified that indirects can be charged. This is also going to win when all is said and done. Trying to see, look at my notes here. And I think I've kind of touched on the highlights. I see I'm about 25 minutes in, and I was kind of told it's about 20, 25 minutes, and I see folks getting ready to go. Any questions that folks have? Yes?
Well, how does this relate to Trump freezing federal dollars to like Harvard University?
Well, that's taking a very different path, because I don't know the details of that one, because that's not impacting us too greatly. But mostly the funds to Harvard, to my understanding, is basically that they're not complying with DEI requirements, and a lot of it is the Hamas Jewish conversation that is going on that campus, and I think that's why they're getting pulled. So it's not so much tied into these particular issues. Oops, sorry. Yes?
Is all this money going to be lost come the Anti-Deficiency Act, September 30th deadline for spending all federal funds?
I'm not familiar with that act, so I don't know the answer to that question.
There's a federal law that says that the money's not spent by the end of the fiscal year to general funds.
I would say, but I know there's different years of money in cycle, and they have a certain number of years to spend it. So there probably would be some funds that would be at risk for that. Because I think they usually have 3 years to spend federal funds. But usually the agencies, because we don't see at the university how old the money is that is appropriated. That's something that's happened within the agencies, that they're spending their old money first. But there probably are going to be some funds that would fall into that category. I saw Kevin up first here.
What is USD's annual research budget? What kind of awards are we in? What kind of categories?
We're usually, from an awards perspective, somewhere in the low 30 millions. Our expenditures was probably better, and awards vary quite a bit from year, because some agencies will report a multi-year award all in 1 year. So how the awards can vary quite a bit. Our expenditures usually run right around 20 million a year, and that's pretty flat. A little north of 20, yeah. Was that?
That's a lot of money.
Oh yeah, because they usually say about 2.5 times the dollars is what the actual impact is in an area. Because you have people that are buying stuff and taking advantage of services and those sorts of things. That's it. Yeah.
I thought I read in the last couple of weeks about some, and maybe not research grants, but grants that have been canceled.
Yep, there have been a few. So we just had, we lost 3 DOE awards, though I believe they'll come back. But we did have 3 other awards that were canceled. They weren't directly awards to USD. They were awards that were made to, 2 of them were made to the Department of Health, the State Department of Health, and 1 was made to the Department of Social Services. And then they passed through to USD. And yes, we did lose 3. All 3 were set to end on May 31st of 2025, and these were basically some of the some funds that the feds had made available for COVID-related research, and feds through the ARPA program. So those were already going to be expired. They had some economic impact for us, and you've seen some things. I know Avel eCare lost some funding that way, so they had to stop some programs that were going on. But again, those were already planning to end. Most administrations would look at the calendar being May 31st, it's going to die. Let's just let it die. But this administration likes to make a show. So, but yes, there was some impact. And then we actually had 1 contract that was canceled. It was with some work we do with the VA up in Fargo, and then just yesterday I signed we're going to do it again sort of thing. So we haven't had much impact so far, but there has been some, and there is some uncertainty. What I don't like right now. is, we have graduate students that are supported on those Department of Energy awards. What are we, that creates uncertainty and instability in their lives, and that I don't like. And so I've had some conversations yesterday that aren't fun conversations to have, but anything else? All right. Well, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.